Welcome to episode 45 of Accessible Finance, where we demystify personal financial topics and answer your questions so you leave saying, get it now. I'm Eric Johns.
And I'm Rachel Johns.
Let's dive in.
All right. So, what was intended to be a 6-part retirement series, our estate planning episode ended up breaking up into a part 1 and part 2.
It was too exciting. It was too exciting for one go.
So, in the last episode, we touched a lot on, what the best vehicles would be to help meet your goals, whether it was to leave large legacies to your children, leave your funds to charity, or spend every last dime prior
Enhancing your
to
quality of life.
exactly. And so in the next phase, we want to talk about some of the legal vehicles and things that I'm sure we've heard about, we may not fully understand, and kind of what scenarios may make sense to use different ones. So I think the very first thing to mention here is that the professionals that you're going to be engaging with when it comes time to prepare your estate are going to be specialists for the most part. So you're going to be dealing with a specialized estate attorney. You're going to be dealing with specialized tax professionals who deal in estate matters, typically. So the majority of professionals in your life at this phase are people that you have likely not engaged with prior. This is also dealing
That's a
with
good point.
all
Really
of
good point.
the
Well said.
thank you. You're also dealing with the remainder of everything that you have, and you're having to put faith and trust that when you are gone, that person is or those people are going to make sure that your wishes are fulfilled. So at this point in time, it is important to surround yourself or find who that trusted individual or individuals are while you're engaging with new professionals that you have not previously had a relationship with. Hopefully, at this point, if you have been working with a financial planner or some type of professional that's kind of helped guide you throughout your life, you have a really great relationship with them, you respect them, you trust them.
Yeah.
Lean on them, utilize them,
Yeah.
have them go with you to the meetings with the estate attorneys, with the accountants, have them be there to make sure that your holistic plan is addressed appropriately in the very specific roles that each play, right?
So this can be a very humbling
Yeah.
experience for, I guess, lay persons or the uninitiated from an estate planning perspective.
Yeah.
When we're talking about like disclaimer trusts and IDGTs and ILETs, and you're like, those are acronyms that I've
So
never heard
many
before,
acronyms.
right? Like, we understand. So, like, I would say, just to preface this discussion, this is one of the areas where I feel like we add the most value
Yeah.
for clients because there are a number of roles that we're doing. Like, we're kind of quarterbacking the whole thing. Like, we're
Mhm.
interacting with the CPAs and the estate attorneys and like having an idea of where the client wants to go because ideally we've had multiple goals discussions over the years.
Yes.
So we understand exactly what they're trying to accomplish. And then we can say, hey, look, this is what they're saying. Like they're talking about, like, and then we go into the scenario and we're trying to, make it more relatable to them. It's not that no one's going to understand what we're saying. It's not rocket science, but it's
Sure.
very esoteric and kind of complex tax. Like there's a lot of legal and tax implications to almost everything you're doing in this phase or in this like in complex estate planning stuff.
Correct.
So and a lot of it, just to be clear, is when we're talking to estate attorneys, you're gonna want at least a will, right? You're gonna want a clear idea of what's going on with assets.
Yep.
We're gonna want to talk through like, should you have this account in your will, or like should you have this account essentially accounted for or spoken for in your will, or should you just have a beneficiary designation if it's possible?
Correct.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of those things?
Exactly.
Right. And then you're going to be going through really complicated stuff if you have an estate tax issue. We spoke in the last episode, if you have a few $1,000,000, only a few $1,000,000, right? Like I'm sure we'd all love that problem. If you had only a few $1,000,000, you might not have to do like some of the more complex. You might not have to, engage with a lot of the like irrevocable trust type stuff or just IDGTs, which stands for intentionally defective grantor trust. And we could talk a little bit about that. We don't want to get in the weeds because there are very few that are actually going to be impacted by this because like we said, you're going to need,
Sure.
well over like $7 million even in 2026. So anyway, long story short is exactly what Rachel said is
Yeah.
true. You're gonna want somebody that that'll be able to at least explain it in layman's terms. If you have a family member that does planning or somebody that you can bring along that's well versed in this stuff, it's gonna be an uncomfortable experience. They're gonna be asking you all kinds of questions, and they're gonna be talking
Yes.
quickly and about things that you've probably never
And
heard before.
I think sometimes,
And we're talking about millions of like in this situation, we're talking about like millions of dollars
yes,
of implications,
yes,
whether it's taxes
yes.
like that are paid or
Mhm.
owed, or like your funds that are moving to like
Correct.
individuals or entities.
The psychological phenomenon of wanting to seem comfortable in
Yes,
situations where you're
boy, is that
not.
prevalent here.
Yes, it plays out. And so when you're sitting there and you're in a room and the person who's talking lives and breathes what they're talking about,
Hmm.
they're going to be talking up here. And so while there are, without a doubt, certain estate attorneys who are really, really good about making what they're saying understandable and bringing it down to a level where you can converse about it, the majority of them don't know how because they're not used to it. They live in the world where they're really only interacting with people who live there. And quite frankly, some of them don't really care because they already know what things they believe to be
Right.
optimal.
They're good at their jobs and they know you need them, right? Like
Correct.
because they're the ones that can create the most bulletproof
I
rules. I
think
mean,
we've all
trust.
experienced that with doctors throughout our lives where not all doctors are created equal. Some are
Right.
really good at explaining procedure and some are not.
Boy, that's true here. So not all
Yeah.
professionals are created equal. So like essentially you're gonna want this is part of the value add, right? Is you're gonna want
Someone.
someone with you
Yeah.
that can evaluate how good these plans are,
Yes.
right? Because most estate attorneys, not all estate, you're not gonna you could go to three different estate attorneys and you will get three very different outcomes.
You've done exactly that
I have
with clients.
yes.
Yes.
They will give you very different recommendations.
Correct.
And so it's our job, frankly, to tell the clients, "Hey, look, this is what's happening, and here's why we think it might be good or bad.
Right.
Here are the options for you to
Right.
consider." Like, well, first we try to present it objectively and in a
Correct.
way that they can understand that's accessible to them.
Correct.
And then we'll try to give, and then most of the time, the clients will be like, well, what do you think we should do?
Yeah.
And then we'll have to kind of weigh in and try to break down why we would or would not follow this advice, or maybe we should
Correct.
seek a second opinion or whatever,
Correct.
right?
It's also important too because when you're going in meeting with these professionals, they don't know you. So they're going to know what it is you're
Mhm.
communicating to them. And so things that because you've lived your life, you know your plan, you know your goals, things that you kind of take for granted or assume like everyone
Right.
knows, they have no idea. And so if those things aren't communicated to them, the plans they produce are not great either. So to have somebody who's able to, like
Understands the
you
whole
said,
picture.
exactly, to kind of quarterback and be able to make sure that the plan that they're working on coming up with for you meets the goals that you've set aside and have reiterated year after year. So before we kind of get into those pieces, I think it's a really, really important thing for
Right.
everybody to just be in agreement about the fact that it is going to be complicated. It's going to be dense. It's going to feel like someone's reading a textbook to you a lot of the times. And it's okay to be overwhelmed and confused. You want to have someone you can say, like,
Right.
explain it to me.
Mhm.
Like, what does that mean?
Exactly.
Completely reasonable.
All right.
Okay, so the things that we had already discussed were like a will, right? So
Yep.
you certainly want a will, and you want to make sure the will is as comprehensive and hits all of the important points to you.
Mhm.
Um, Power of attorney.
Correct. Incredibly important,
Yeah,
especially as you age. We talked in a couple episodes ago about end of life care.
yeah,
A lot of times when you're here, you don't want to get to a point where it's too late. You don't want to get to a point where you don't have powers of attorney,
right.
right? Or you're in a state where you're just
Cognitive.
kind of
This,
manipulative, like you're kind of malleable,
yeah.
and you don't really know. I mean, you kind of know what's going on, but you're not
Mhm.
all there, and so you really want to have this stuff all
Right.
ironed out well before that happens
Correct.
with people that you trust to not abuse it,
Well,
right?
and
Like,
that's exactly. I mean, there's an entire sect of the law that is focused on like elder abuse and things like that because this is one of the riskiest age groups.
right. You
It's
have the most assets and
correct.
you're the most vulnerable,
Yeah.
right? Like, unfortunately, that's just the reality. Like,
This
we're not all going to be firing on all cylinders in our,
correct.
70s, 80s, and 90s.
Correct. So making sure that you are well cared for, surrounded by somebody that you trust during the times when these people are going to be coming
Mhm.
out trying to help you and you may have some bad actors in the
Right.
mix.
So power of attorney.
Yeah.
Let's say that I have power of attorney for you, Rach, and
Yep.
you're in your 70s. What can I do?
Ooh, good question. Good question. So it depends upon how the power of attorney is laid out. They have ones that are specific for certain reasons, right? So you have your medical power of attorney, which says like you can only help make medical care decisions when I'm
Hmm.
unable to do so. So if I'm 70, I may have medical issues. I may be going into the hospital. I might be under surgery, and the doctor has to come out and say, "Oh my gosh, it's worse than we thought." We need to decide like, are we going to put her on life support? Are we going to do transfusion? Right? Make the decisions. So having somebody that they can quickly get an answer from at times of essence is
Hmm.
really, really important. So there are when you're writing out the power of attorney, right? There are certain templates that a lot of people will use. But depending upon the verbiage of that power of attorney, it conveys to whoever's listed there
Hmm.
certain rights and responsibilities that you would ordinarily have yourself as a major.
Okay. So if I'm hearing you right, if I have so if I'm hearing you right, there's a lot of variance in powers of attorney.
Significant.
Okay.
Yes.
If I have a general power of attorney, and your goal when you gave it to me was that I just get to do things, act as your, fiduciary in all aspects of your life, what can I do? Can I cash your checks? Can I sign your checks? Like, can I move money within and among accounts?
You're going to do everything for me, huh?
That's, the dollar signs might light up if you
Yeah.
have an unsavory actor as your fiduciary in this spot, or your power of attorney. You're granting a power of attorney to somebody that
You're
seems a little too eager to get it.
exactly. Exactly. It's important to know just how much power you're turning
Right?
over.
Because my understanding is that I can do essentially all of those
Mhm.
things that I listed, right? I
You
can
can
move
act
money, I can
right.
sell, buy securities within accounts, I can dump your retirement accounts into my account
Mhm.
if I wanted to.
Exactly. Power of attorney is essentially granting to you all the same rights and responsibilities that I would have.
Yeah, they're
So
just
you
going to
can
treat me like
assign
I'm you walking
as
to the
needed.
bank.
Correct. It is incredibly important, and unfortunately, we've seen, and there's well-established case law as well of family members that come out of the woodworks, or friends of the family, or neighbors that will come over and
All too happy to help.
try to take care of aging or elderly people. They end up convincing them, this power of attorney is great. And the thing is, while there are certain recourses that you can have, such as, mental competency issues and stuff like that, unringing that bell is still so much harder than just not doing it in the first place.
Right.
So it's very, very
But the thing
important.
is, it's also important that you give someone power of attorney. So it's
Correct.
kind of rough, right? Like you
Correct.
kind of need to do
It's
it,
very
but
scary.
you need to decide, but you need to make the right decision, right? Like
Yes,
this decision is very high risk, high reward.
it is because you
You have
are
a
putting all your eggs in a
responsible
basket.
individual, right? Like if
It's
I have,
amazing.
yeah, it's great because you're not going to want to, you might not remember to do all the things you need to do. You're not going to remember to do
Correct.
this. You might not want to be the one making decisions. You might you definitely could
Mhm.
make the wrong decisions. I'm sure when I lose my cognitive facilities, I'll start making some pretty questionable decisions, right?
Then we get to decide which of our children's responsible.
Oh, that's going to be fun. Can't wait.
But it's such a scary position to be in. Particularly if you are hyper aware of how much you are declining. Like being aware of your declining mental capacity and physical abilities is already frustrating, emotional.
Mhm.
You're going to be at an incredibly vulnerable place. So you want to be able to make this decision before you're there. You
Mhm.
want to be able to make that decision when you are as objective and comfortable
Right.
with what that decision is. Again, this is another reason you want to reassess and evaluate kind of regularly, because if I was to give
Yeah.
power of attorney to somebody who then I decide later on, like, yikes,
Right.
I don't want to forget to undo that. Um,
Correct.
so yeah, it's an incredibly stressful place to be in.
Along the same lines, this is one of the reasons to do preemptive planning
Yes.
in the way that we talked about before with
Yeah,
maybe some of these more complicated strategies.
correct.
If we think these strategies are going to be complicated for you to understand when you're sitting across from a state attorney in your like 50s,
Yeah.
just imagine when you're in your like 70s trying to understand this stuff when you've already started to go and you've maybe been retired for a few years, you're kind of,
Yeah.
you're a bit slower on the uptake, so to speak. So
It's hard.
yeah, you really want to get this stuff in place long before it's needed and before it's too late for you to really, understand exactly what's happening. You don't want to be like guided entirely. Maybe even you, because the idea is with all of estate planning, our goal and your goal should be to like institute your wishes. We're trying to codify the things that you want, not your POA
Correct.
or us or any other fiduciary. It needs to be you.
Yeah.
Even, you know what I mean? Like it's your money. You've earned it. Like you've saved it, right?
Mm.
Like so it shouldn't be anybody else's decision who's gonna where this money goes, how it's gonna be spent, how much gets to be spent on your care versus like how much are we gonna try to prioritize the estate for the
Correct.
potentially for your POA, right? Like
What exactly.
because it's likely
Sometimes
to be your child or some beneficiary in some
yes.
capacity, right? So
And that's what becomes
it'd be
challenging
brutal.
because sometimes there end up being some perverse incentives
Yeah.
because um
Yeah, if
the
I forgo putting you in Lambeth House and I
yeah,
just throw you, you know,
if we go to
in
the
the backyard, maybe in a
if we
tent,
go to the budget barn down the way, um
then I might get a couple, you
to
know, ten
preserve
thousand dollars a month there.
correct. Correct. And so I think, we all want to believe and know that we have somebody in our life who we trust implicitly to be able to prioritize our well-being.
Mhm.
Um, it's it's a challenging place to be. And this is again harkening back to kind of what we were talking about before, is that having a unbiased, trustworthy professional in your life is critical.
Mhm.
Um, this is not to say that that's who should have the power of attorney. That is not what I'm
Mhm.
saying. But it is to say that it's somebody who can sit there.
Usually that creates conflicts, by the way, so it's
Correct.
usually not something that the professional is
Exactly.
going to do.
And if it is, then you should be a little like,
Yeah,
be a little
beware
wary.
if your planner or anybody, any other professional's like, I'll do
Yeah.
it.
If you're a planner, if
Fill
you're
me in, coach.
attorney, yes, exactly. Um, but having somebody who you have worked with for right, like ideally, our ideal scenario in working with our clients is to essentially if we start working with you when you're 40, for example, we are establishing the continuation of your work plan, right?
Mhm.
Then we're establishing your retirement plan. We are helping to make sure that your estate plan goes off without a hitch. We've known you for decades, right? As your wishes have changed, we've been there with you. So then the point in time that all of this kind of comes to fruition, like we're able to essentially make sure, and hopefully you have somebody in your life who's doing this, can make sure that the end part of the plan, like you're not fumbling it at the like 1 yard line, right? Like,
Great analogy.
thank you.
Love it.
Thanks. We said we were quarterbacks in the last one. So
Yeah, yeah, you're going with it.
but yeah, I think
Running
that
with the ball. Well
it's
done.
well, sticking with football.
All right, great.
So but yes, it's incredibly important because you are gonna want things in place like a will,
Hmm.
like a power of attorney.
Yep.
Um, again, you may decide that who you have as your power of attorney for like legal and financial and fiduciary matters may be separate and apart from the person who you want to have your
Hmm.
like medical directives, which is fine.
Right.
Um, and so then you really start looking at other vehicles with which to care for the funds, such as trusts, right?
Right.
Things like
Yeah, yeah.
this.
So just real quick to dive into a little bit of the weeds here on the trust, right? So we talked a little bit in the past episode, and we talked here about how they're complicated. They being trusts are like just inherently complicated
Mhm.
and create, some complexity around tax time and just some extra costs as well. So like what are those? What are those complications? What are those costs? Well, trusts are typically going to have to file a 1041, their own tax return, essentially. You're going to have a trustee, which if it's not one of your kids, because maybe when you make the trust, they're young or they can't do it or you don't want them to do it. You don't really like have faith in them to carry out all of their responsibilities. You will have to pay the trustee. So now we have an annual cost, which if we're talking about like an ILIT, which is an irrevocable life insurance trust, there are banks that are willing to serve as trustee, but they'll do it for a few $1,000s a year. So you might be paying a couple $1,000s a year every year for the privilege of the bank to take your insurance premium check. So irrevocable life insurance trust. What that means is you create an entity, the trust, that's separate from your person, and irrevocable means you can't touch it again. So you're essentially putting this life insurance policy in a treasure box that you can no longer open and touch again and move around, right? So you're going to do this and then throw away the key so you don't have it anymore. You're handing the key over to the trustee. And so now they're responsible for it. They're going to have to take your insurance premiums, which are going to count as present year gifts, annual exclusion gifts to the beneficiaries
Yeah.
in their respective proportions. So like if you have two kids and then you pay $4,000 of life insurance premiums, that's considered a $2,000 gift to child one, a $2,000 gift to child two. Okay. So you can do that you can gift that into the trust and then pay the trustee a fee So you might be paying, if it's $4,000 premium, you might pay like 6,000, and the trustee will just take 2,000 and put it in their pocket for the privilege of mailing your check now
Yeah.
to the insurance company, the $4,000 insurance premium to the insurance company,
Right.
right? So it creates those additional costs.
Yeah.
You might have to file 1041s, right? And then there has to be an additional administration component when the death benefits paid out. The trustee is going to, take their benefits for or take their fee for distributing those assets to your kids. But the idea is that you're enabling gifting to an entity,
Correct.
right? Because you might not trust just gifting directly to the kids and then having them pay the premiums themselves,
Correct.
right? Because you might not want that. And then if you were to gift a policy within 3 years of your death, it's ripped back into your estate. Okay, so anyway, that's a little bit in the weeds, but the idea is when you create these trusts, you're creating complexity
Mhm.
and cost.
Mhm.
So you can think of it as a few $1,000s a year. So, but often this is still advantageous because if you have things like if you have maybe you have we've talked about this before, maybe you have 3 kids
Yeah.
and one is like a pillar of the community,
Yep.
like
We
run
talked
community
about that.
service, right? Like excellent. And maybe 2 and 3 are just not on the right track. Maybe they've been in and out of rehabs. Maybe they have, substance abuse issues. Maybe they just aren't responsible with dollars. Maybe they just have a bunch of credit card debt. Maybe child
Right.
3 is living, a great life on face. They have brand new cars and everything else, but they have a ton of debt. Their
Yeah.
balance sheet is profoundly
Yep.
negative,
Nearly bankrupt.
right?
Yeah.
So like when you have these situations, you can create a trust that might distribute funds to children 2 and 3, maybe even have hurdles, like if child 2 stays clean or whatever, like that you can have a
Correct.
trustee that has discretion to
Yep.
distribute the funds. And you get the
There
idea.
can
There
some
are a
things you could set up.
bunch of strings you can attach to your money,
Correct.
and you might want to do so because it might be prudent,
Right.
frankly, so that your kids can, responsibly handle money or at least get used to it.
Yeah.
Maybe you just have a trust that says, they'll get the money when they're 35 or 40 instead of
Exactly.
18 because you
Right.
don't trust that they'll make responsible decisions when they're 18. And
Correct.
hard to blame you.
Your kids also might be minors.
Also true.
Yes.
Right. So yeah, there are reasons for it. We just want to be able to discuss the pros and cons,
Correct.
right?
It's
Complexity
definitely
and
not
costs are the
a
cons. There are
yes.
pros, right?
Yes.
Like there very much are.
For sure. And I think it's important to understand that trusts are not all good or all bad.
Exactly.
Um,
No, they're just tools.
yes,
So it's a matter of how you use them.
correct. Because I do think that there tends to be this thought that like if you have trust, like people who have lots of money have trusts, right? That trust just automatically means like I have a lot of money. So if you are looking at an estate that's worth more than you thought, you might think, oh, I need a trust, right?
Mhm.
So it's very important that you understand how many the varied types of trusts there are, the costs that are associated with them, because there are some,
Oh
like
yeah.
you were delineating, and they can certainly add up.
Right.
So you may be less likely to do that if you're in the boat of my goal is to leave as much money as possible to my kids. Um, because you're going to be leaving a bit less if you're going down the road of trust due to the costs of just
Yeah. It's a
paying the trustee.
it's a conversation that you should definitely have,
Correct.
right? So
Correct.
if you enjoyed today's episode,
Yeah.
please review the show. And if you have any questions
Yeah.
you'd like discussed or financial problems you'd like solved, please reach out to us at podcast@equilibriumfp.com or visit the website equilibriumfp.com.
Yes. And stay tuned because our next few episodes are going to be a culmination of various articles, headlines, and statements that I have found. And we're going to do an Eric Reacts. And for those of you who don't know,
This could be good.
for those of
This
you
could
who
get me in
don't,
trouble.
for those of you who don't know, Eric does not have a poker face. So,
I'm not great
well,
at pulling
actually,
punches, huh?
you're pretty good at poker. But yes, no, he will not hold back. So I'm intentionally trying to find some that are going to get reactions. So please
Provocative.
join.
Got
Please
some
join us.
provocative clips. All
Yes.
right.
Till
Well,
next time.
all righty. Thanks, guys.